55%, or around 33 million South Africans, live in poverty. A quarter live in extreme poverty or earn less than 624 Rand a month. However, unlike South Africa's other crushing systemic issues such as unemployment or spatial apartheid, the solution might be simple: a permanent basic income grant where those living below the breadline are given money every month. Now, this is not a new idea. Back in 2002, a government-commissioned report studied it and recommended its implementation. They also warned of dire consequences if it wasn't introduced. But it was only in the pandemic, with the introduction of the 350 Rand Social Relief of Distress grant, that South Africans got something that, if you squinted it, looks like a basic income grant. Yet this grant, which critics argue is set way too low, is setting up a looming showdown between those who believe that the finance minister should expand and extend it, and those who oppose the idea. This concept, the basic income grant, has a lot of nuance to it, and this video tries to unpack some of that by asking whether it would be effective, how much it would cost, whether it has enough political support, and ultimately, if it's worthwhile. A good place to start is to point out that social grants have been one of the South African government's most successful policies since 1994. Unlike the billions spent on education, job creation with dubious results, childcare and old age grants have measurable long-term benefits. For instance, the South African Child Support Grant Impact Assessment found that children receiving the grant skip school less, get sick less often, are less likely to fall pregnant, consume less alcohol and drugs, and have fewer sexual partners. South Africa has an extensive grant system, particularly for a developing country. However, this safety net has a massive hole in it. There are no grants for 17 million able-bodied people who aren't formally employed and who earn less than 624 Rand a month, and who live in an economy that can't provide jobs for them. In this situation, there's some evidence that a basic income grant could be effective. A study was conducted in a small community close to Windhoek in 2008, where everyone was given 100 Rand a month for 12 months. The researchers found that household food poverty dropped from 76% to 37%. This is despite some people migrating to their family members in the area because of the grant, thus diluting its effects. People also spent more money at the local health clinic, crime rates dropped, and economic activity increased as people started their own small businesses. While some people doubt that a BIG will actually be effective, the main opposition to the grant has more to do with its cost. Critics say that it's simply unaffordable. And to understand this argument, we need to understand the sorry state of South Africa's public finances. Huge numbers aside, the biggest problem with South Africa's finances is that our debt is expensive, and the country is growing its debt faster than its economy. Take last year, for example. The government spent around 1.9 trillion Rand. However, it only expected to collect about 1.4 trillion. This deficit of 410 billion is paid for with borrowed money, usually in the form of bonds. Now, running a deficit itself is not a problem. South Africa almost always runs a deficit, and so do many other countries. However, the rate at which South Africa borrows money has increased faster than the size of its economy until it's reached 81% of GDP. Now, although that's high, there are other countries that have higher ratios without experiencing disastrous effects. The real problem is that after years of economic stagnation, ratings downgrades, corruption, and huge systemic issues, South African debt is perceived as risky, meaning that the government has to pay higher annual bond yields in order to attract enough buyers. Those yields are reflected in the national budget as debt service costs. Because the total debt continues to grow faster than the economy, and because the bond yields remain high, these costs keep spiraling upwards, taking up an increasingly large chunk of national expenditure. This is money that could be spent on service delivery. Treasury's answer to this, the golden thread that can be found throughout their latest medium-term budget statement, is to end the spiral by narrowing and finally eliminating that gap between tax revenue and expenditure. In fact, Treasury plans are running a primary surplus by 2024. So that leaves the question, how expensive is a basic income grant? The left-leaning Institute for Economic Justice has commissioned research on this question, and the answer comes down to two factors. One, how many people qualify and sign up for the grant, and secondly, how much money each person is given. A basic income grant where everyone between 18 and 59 is eligible would cost between 213 and 462 billion a year. A more likely version of the BIG, covering those not formally employed, would cost anywhere from 180 to 391 billion. Extending the 350 Rand Social Relief of Distress grant would cost 90 billion at full take-up. An important point to make is that In the first few years, the actual cost of any BIG is likely to be a lot lower. Experience with previous grants shows that getting all eligible people signed up or even reaching the 80% threshold takes years. This video is assuming a worst case costing scenario. To put these numbers into context, government's total spending is a little over 2 trillion rand a year, of which government spends 204 billion on social grants. Depending on which option the government implements, it could eventually increase the budget significantly. Engenis Sonona, who previously worked at the Department of Social Development and who currently works for Black Sash, believes it's not about cost.
To say there is simply no money. And for me, it's not an issue of whether there's money. There is money. And I think we've seen it in so many things that where they are willing to spend on, they do, simply do. Even now, you look at what ESCOM, you look at what SAA bailouts and all those type of things. Where there is a will or political will to spend on, they do spend.
In the long run, a BIG probably won't be paid with debt, explains Michael Sachs, an economist at WITS and formerly of National Treasury.
To say we cannot afford it, because the way it's articulated by many people, and I think the way it's understood by many people, is somehow government must look at its budget and decide whether government can afford it. That's completely the wrong approach. So every cent. So I suppose netting out the reflow into VAT. Ultimately, if you look at any country with high welfare payments, they have high taxes that pay for those welfare payments. Sweden doesn't somehow, generate the resources for welfare payments from some, other place except from taxes.
So how much tax are we talking about? The IEJ commissioned extensive modelling on this, and I've cherry-picked a few options of how government could raise enough for a modest BIG. Firstly, about 12% of the total cost would automatically be reclaimed when grantees spend the money on VAT-rated goods. Secondly, the government could raise income taxes. An extra 1% on the lower income earners, rising to 3% on higher income earners, could raise about 67 billion. The third method would be to get rid of certain tax breaks for the wealthy, such as pension fund deductions and the medical aid tax credit. This could raise another 28 billion. A luxury VAT tax could yield 8.5 billion, and canning some government programs like the employment tax incentive, which hasn't been shown to work, could save 5 billion. There are also newer forms of taxation. For example, a wealth tax that could take a while to set up but could bring in about 60 billion, and a financial transactions tax that could yield 40 billion. Essentially, whether it's through simply increasing existing taxes or implementing newer forms of taxation, it becomes possible to pay for a basic income grant. But is the government willing to do this? The current Minister of Finance has described the grant in the past as creating a cycle of dependency. The other department involved in the BIG, the Department of Social Development, is in favour of a basic income grant. President Ramaphosa, who holds the balance of power, has said that he wants the public to decide, and has recently said that government should examine the feasibility of the grant. Treasury, academics and others have examined its feasibility as far back as 20 years ago, and arguably people elected the president to decide such issues. But let's consider the question.
I think that our underlying problems are about the distribution of assets, land, spatial inequalities, educational inequalities, kind of fundamental real economic issues that result in a highly skewed, a divided society. And simply redistributing, and again, really reducing poverty and hunger is not to be sneezed at, but it doesn't really it's not going to address those issues. And I think people are too sanguine about, or people seem to think that it's going to kind of put us on a different path of development, and I don't think it will. I think we're going to still be a stagnating, highly unequal economy, but with a much improved social safety net.
Would say we would rather fund, take money and try to create jobs. And my argument has always been, I am supposed to trust you now after 20 some odd years, to suddenly believe that you're going to create jobs within the next 5 years. I mean, we are on our fourth or fifth economic strategy paper, RDP, GEAR, as GISA, and now the NDP, which is ending in 2030. And the promises of all those documents have basically failed. They haven't come to fruition. So the argument from our side is, yes, we agree you need to create jobs, but in the meantime, let's not let people starve or go hungry.
Perhaps the questions we're asking about this notorious BIG are wrong. It's not about whether it would be effective, whether the country could pay for it. The real question is, do politicians and the middle class give enough of a damn about the 33 million living in poverty to pay higher taxes?